Where did the name Sweetwater come from?
Ah, good one. We formed a band quite by accident. We literally had, I don't know if you saw the VH1 movie. We had a band together where we were jamming and we were loaded and all that stuff. And there was this girl out in the audience singing over this jam that we were doing, and it fit perfectly. And so Albert, who was playing the flute at that time over a microphone, beckoned her up on stage, and she just walked on stage and sang that song, which turned out to be an old gospel, kind of a spiritual song, Motherless Child, and it fit very well. And everybody went nuts in the place, and then she walked off and disappeared. And we didn't know who she was or anything. It was quite an accident. So we spent a month or so looking for her. Unlike the movie, it didn't happen overnight. It was a long time. We said, who was she? And then it turned out that someone knew her and so forth. And we asked her to be in a band, and she was still in high school, and it was just ridiculous. But that's how we formed the band. But we had no name, and we went on, and we practiced and practiced and practiced because we wanted to be really good the first time we went out. And during that summer of practicing, Monterey Pop Festival came along, and we didn't know what a pop festival was. There wasn't such a thing yet. That was the first pop festival. So we all, we didn't have 10 cents between us, but we went up there in a couple of cars and slept in the cars and stuff and hung out and wanted to see what that was all about. And Albert went to a local stream and washed his face and drank some of the water and stuff and came back raving about Sweetwater. And so later when we had a band meeting and sat around and everybody made up names that they thought the band should be called, that was one of them. And I liked it. It was one word. It didn't say "the" in front of it, which every other band did at the time. And I said, let's just call it Sweetwater. Bam, one name. We were pretty much experimental. Everything was an experiment. We chose weird instruments and things, and so it was always an experiment to see if things would work together and see if we could make these strange instruments flow together and still be a rock band. And it would never quit being an experiment. We literally didn't have a guitar. Not when we went in to record, we did not have a guitarist, and all other rock bands had guitar players. In fact, they were consisted of mostly guitar players, 3 guitar players and a bass player and a drummer or something like that. And we were just quite different from that. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if Nancy mentioned this earlier, but in those days there was less than a handful of females who sang rock. Literally, Grace Slick, Janis Joplin, maybe Lydia Pence, and Nancy. That was it. Linda Ronstadt wasn't really rock. She was kind of country at first, and she slipped into country rock at some point. But even so, I'm talking about before that, when we were putting the band together. And so it was still an experiment.
Can you talk a little bit about what the creative process in a band was like back when there was no computer?
Oh, no computer. Yeah. It was amazing, actually. Back in the days when we were recording, for instance, you were limited by how things were, the technology of the day. Everything was done on tape, and you had to, in the studio, time was money. And there was a big clock on the wall, and you always obeyed that clock. You had to get a bunch of stuff done in a certain amount of time, and so you had to come in with the right feeling, and everybody had to be on the same wavelength, and you had to get it done that day or it wasn't done. I think classic rock is absolutely evolving. There will always be someone who will take it upon themselves to come out and reinvent it in some way. And if they're honest about it, that usually comes through. People can see that and feel it. And I believe that'll happen. It may be a resurgence again, like everything else. Music folds back on itself all the time. And classic rock will never die. When people have a burning desire to be a musician these days, most people look back on that era that inspires them. And that's the era that inspires most people. I'm not going to talk dirt about some of the stuff that's out on, in the public today. But even so, that stuff is not that inspirational. And again, it goes back to the burning inside that people just wanted to scream and let it out and let the world know what they were passionate about, whatever it was. Metal basically evolved from early classic rock, the stuff you look at as classic rock today, and it became more about the intricacy of the playing, the chops, that kind of stuff, the sounds, what you plugged into and how many stomp boxes you had and all this sort of stuff. And it became, it just evolved and evolved. Then there's speed metal and there's all these different types of metal and all this sort of stuff. And
do you think metal itself is classic rock? Some of it, or no?
Some of it is. The early Led Zepp stuff was definitely like that, and then they evolved as well. I mean, crazily. It brought in Middle Eastern influences and stuff, like as we did with My Crystal Spider, and we tried to mix a little of everything with our music, but we were nuts.
What is rockabilly exactly?
Rockabilly was more or less self-taught guys that were coming out of like the mountains and the back country and stuff, wanting to do rock and roll, and it was a little more raw, and had a lot of energy. It was wonderful, and that's the thing that happened to classic rock in general. What we now look back on as that era of classic rock, it became more and more sophisticated, and it kind of unspooled because it became so sophisticated that it sort of killed the passion and the energy and all that rawness that started it in the first place. I remember Fred and I having this discussion back when our band was still out and playing in the 60s about the Beatles. Kennedy had just been shot and everyone was on a downer, and then all of a sudden the Beatles came along, and it was like a nice relief to get our mind off all that, and thinking that the whole world wasn't in fact going to hell in a handbasket, and they were great. They were funny and so forth. They just took us along with them, and they became better and better and better, and they evolved, and they took the genre, and they always kept it rock and rolly. They kept the beat and pretty much the passion, and they kept that going. And whatever they did, the whole world went along with them. Took the whole world on the ride with them. It's pretty amazing, really. We played probably the Texas International Pop Fest. We played 2 weeks after Woodstock. It was a pretty huge thing, but not as big as Woodstock. And Led Zepp was on that bill, but the people there didn't understand them. They didn't get them, didn't really understand what they were doing. And it took a while for them to get going. And that was a different thing. Musicians look up to Led Zepp and go crazy and all that sort of stuff. But general public, I don't even know if they would look at them as highly regarded as the Beatles in terms of what the Beatles did. I wouldn't have thought that anyone would look at 90s bands at all as classic rock. But when you look at some of them, you realize that they are heavily influenced by that, and they reach back into that vault when they want to come up with something that sounds, that has that same kind of feeling.
People still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.